When the Great Depression hit the South, families didn't starve. They got creative. Armed with nothing but scraps, leftovers, and whatever grew wild in the backyard, our grandparents turned poverty into a feast. These 25 forgotten poor meals tell the story of survival, ingenuity, and the unbreakable spirit that built the American South. Beans and cornbread. Every Southern kitchen had two things that never ran out: dried beans and cornmeal. This combination became the backbone of survival cooking, filling bellies when money was scarce. Grandmothers would soak navy beans overnight, then simmer them slow and low with whatever seasonings they could find. Maybe an onion, some salt, or a precious ham bone if they were lucky. The beans would cook until they were creamy and thick, creating their own rich gravy. The cornbread wasn't the sweet, cake-like version we know today. This was made with just cornmeal, water, salt, and maybe a little lard if the family was fortunate. Baked in a cast-iron skillet until golden and crusty, it served as both bread and spoon. You'd crumble it right into the bean pot, letting it soak up all those flavors. This meal could feed 8 people for pennies, and the protein from the beans kept families strong through the hardest times. The beauty wasn't in fancy ingredients. It was in the way simple foods could become something nourishing and satisfying. Red beans and rice. Monday was wash day across the South, and that meant red beans and rice for supper. This dish came from necessity. While women spent all day scrubbing clothes by hand, the beans could simmer unattended on the back of the stove. Red kidney beans were cheap, especially bought in bulk, and rice was often the most affordable grain available. The magic happened when these humble ingredients met in the pot with whatever scraps of meat the family could spare. Often, this meant the leftover ham bone from Sunday dinner, or maybe some salt pork or andouille if the family was doing well. The beans would cook down until they were creamy and thick, creating a rich, hearty sauce that coated the rice perfectly. Seasonings were simple but effective: onions, celery, garlic if available, and maybe some bay leaves from the tree growing in the yard. The dish stretched a little meat into a meal that could feed a large family, providing complete protein when beans and rice combined. Every grain of rice was precious, and nothing went to waste in these kitchens where survival depended on making the most of every ingredient. Hoppin John. New Year's Day meant Hoppin John on every Southern table. But during hard times, this dish appeared whenever black-eyed peas were available. The tradition said eating this would bring good luck and prosperity, something desperately needed during the Depression era. Black-eyed peas were considered poor man's food, which meant they were often the most affordable protein available. Combined with rice and whatever pork could be found, this became a complete meal that could feed a family for days. The peas would cook until tender with a ham hock, salt pork, or even just bacon grease if meat was too expensive. Onions and garlic added flavor when available, and the rice absorbed all the rich cooking liquid from the peas. What made this dish special wasn't just the taste, it was the hope it represented. Every spoonful was a prayer for better times, a connection to tradition when everything else seemed uncertain. Families would eat this, knowing their grandparents had survived on the same simple ingredients, passing down both recipes and resilience through each generation. The dish proved that sometimes the humblest ingredients could create the richest traditions. Black-eyed peas with ham hock. When the smokehouse yielded a ham hock, it was treated like treasure in Depression-era kitchens. This single piece of meat would flavor an entire pot of black-eyed peas, transforming them from simple legumes into a rich, satisfying meal. The ham hock would simmer for hours, releasing its smoky essence into the cooking liquid while the meat slowly fell off the bone. Black-eyed peas were perfect for this type of cooking. They held their shape while absorbing all those deep, meaty flavors. The cooking liquid became as precious as the peas themselves, creating a rich pot liquor that was full of nutrients and flavor. Children would dip their cornbread into this liquid, getting every drop of nourishment possible. The ham hock meat, once tender enough to shred with a fork, would be mixed back into the peas, stretching one piece of meat to feed an entire family. Seasonings were kept simple: salt, pepper, maybe some onion if available. This wasn't about fancy spices. It was about extracting maximum flavor and nutrition from minimal ingredients, proving that patience and skill could turn poverty into plenty. Poor man's stew. When families could afford a small amount of beef or mutton, it was stretched into a stew that could feed everyone for several meals. This wasn't about tender cuts or expensive ingredients. It was about making the most of tough meat and cheap vegetables through long, slow cooking. The meat would be cut into small pieces and browned if fat was available for frying, then covered with water and simmered until it began to tenderize. Potatoes were the primary filler, cut into chunks and added to the pot along with onions if available. Sometimes carrots, turnips, or other root vegetables would be included, depending on what was growing in the garden or available at the market. The stew would simmer for hours, allowing the tough meat to become tender, while the vegetables absorbed all the rich, meaty flavors. Flour might be added to thicken the broth, creating a rich gravy that made the meal more filling and satisfying. This dish taught the value of patience. Good food took time, and tough circumstances could be overcome with persistence and skill. Collard greens with pork hock. Collard greens grew like weeds in southern gardens, which made them perfect for families who needed to stretch every dollar. These tough, hardy leaves could survive frost and neglect, providing nutrition when other vegetables failed. But raw collards were bitter and tough. They needed the magic touch of slow cooking with a pork hock to become the beloved dish that graced every southern table. The pork hock would simmer for hours, creating a rich, smoky broth that would tenderize even the toughest greens. The pot liquor that resulted from this long cooking process was liquid gold, packed with vitamins, minerals, and flavor that nothing else could provide. Families would save every drop, using it to cook rice or sopping it up with cornbread. The greens themselves would cook down from a massive pile to a manageable portion, concentrating all their nutrition into tender, flavorful leaves. Children who might turn their noses up at vegetables would eagerly eat these greens, drawn in by the smoky pork flavor. This dish represented the Southern principle of waste, not, want not, turning garden weeds and scraps of meat into a nutritious, delicious meal that could sustain a family through the hardest times. Ham hocks with pinto beans. Pinto beans were the workhorses of Depression-era cooking, and when paired with ham hocks, they created meals that could last for days. These speckled beans had the perfect texture for long, slow cooking. They would break down just enough to create a creamy, thick pot, while still maintaining some of their shape. The ham hock added not just flavor, but essential fats and proteins that growing families desperately needed during lean times. The cooking process was an art form passed down through generations. The beans would soak overnight, then simmer slowly with the ham hock, onions, and whatever seasonings the family could afford. As the hours passed, the ham would become fork tender, while the beans absorbed all those rich, smoky flavors. The result was a thick, hearty stew that could be eaten over rice, with cornbread, or simply by itself. Leftover bean liquid would be saved and used as a base for other soups, ensuring that nothing valuable went to waste. This dish taught children the value of patience. Good things came to those who waited for the beans to cook properly, just like good times would come to those who persevered through hardship. Smothered pork chops. When a family could afford pork chops, they were treated with the reverence reserved for special occasions. But these weren't the thick, juicy chops we might think of today. These were often thin, tough cuts that required special handling to become tender and flavorful. The technique of smothering solved this problem beautifully, turning inexpensive, tough meat into a rich, gravy-laden feast that could feed more people than the original chops alone. The chops would be dredged in flour and browned in a cast iron skillet, creating a golden crust that would hold in what moisture remained. Then came the magic. Onions, more flour, and liquid would be added to create a thick, rich gravy that would slowly cook the chops until they were tender enough to cut with a fork. This gravy would stretch the meal, serving over rice or mashed potatoes to feed a larger family. The flour used for dredging wasn't wasted. It helped thicken the gravy, making every ingredient count. This dish taught the art of transformation, showing how tough circumstances could be overcome with patience, skill, and creativity. Sausage and biscuits. Saturday mornings often meant sausage and biscuits, but during hard times, this meal had to stretch further than usual. A small amount of breakfast sausage would be crumbled and cooked until crispy, then mixed into a rich gravy made from the rendered fat, flour, and milk when available. The biscuits were made from simple ingredients: flour, lard, buttermilk, and salt. But they were the vehicle that made this meal filling and satisfying. The sausage gravy would be ladled generously over split biscuits, creating a hearty breakfast that could sustain working men through long days of physical labor. When sausage was too expensive, families would substitute bacon grease or ham drippings, still creating that essential rich, meaty flavor that made plain biscuits into a feast. The key was in the roux, cooking the flour in the fat until it was just right, then slowly adding liquid to create a smooth, thick gravy without lumps. This dish represented Southern hospitality even in poverty, showing that simple ingredients could create something that felt abundant and special when prepared with love and skill. Brunswick stew. Brunswick stew was born from necessity and community spirit, created when neighbors would pool their resources to make something special from whatever they had on hand. The original versions included whatever meat was available: squirrel, rabbit, chicken, or pork, combined with whatever vegetables could be found or grown. During the Depression, this became the perfect way to use up scraps and leftovers, creating a thick, hearty stew that could feed a crowd from surprisingly little. The base was usually tomatoes, either fresh from the garden or canned when the family could afford them. Lima beans, corn, potatoes, and onions would be added, along with any meat that could be spared. The stew would simmer for hours, allowing all the flavors to meld together, while the ingredients broke down into a thick, rich consistency. What made Brunswick stew special was its flexibility. No two pots were ever exactly alike, depending on what ingredients were available. This taught families to be creative with their cooking, to see potential in leftovers and scraps, and to understand that good food came from technique and patience, rather than expensive ingredients. Chicken bog. In the South Carolina Lowcountry, chicken bog was the ultimate comfort food, stretching one chicken into a meal that could feed an entire family, plus unexpected guests. This wasn't a soup. It was a thick, hearty dish, where rice, chicken, and sausage came together in perfect harmony. The name, bog, came from the way the rice would absorb all the cooking liquid, creating a thick, almost risotto-like consistency that was both filling and flavorful. The chicken would be boiled until tender, creating a rich stock that would cook the rice. The meat would be pulled from the bones and mixed back into the pot along with whatever sausage the family could afford. Sometimes, just a small amount to add flavor. Other times, more if the family was doing well. Onions, celery, and peppers would add vegetables to the mix, creating a complete meal in one pot. This dish was perfect for feeding crowds at church gatherings or family reunions, stretching affordable ingredients into something that felt abundant and special. The beauty of chicken bog was in its simplicity. Just a few ingredients cooked together with patience and care, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. Rice and gravy. When the cupboard was nearly bare, rice and gravy could make a meal from almost nothing. Rice was cheap, filling, and could be bought in large quantities, while gravy could be made from drippings, flour, and water when milk wasn't available. This combination became a staple for families who needed to stretch every ingredient as far as possible, while still creating something that felt like a real meal. The gravy might be made from bacon drippings, sausage fat, or even just lard mixed with flour and seasoned with salt and pepper. Sometimes, if the family was fortunate, there might be bits of meat mixed in, cracklings from rendering lard, small pieces of ham, or crumbles of sausage. The rice would be cooked until fluffy and tender. Then the gravy would be ladled generously over top. This dish taught children that luxury wasn't about expensive ingredients. It was about taking care with simple ones, making sure the rice was perfectly cooked and the gravy was smooth and flavorful. Even in poverty, there could be pride in preparing food well. Grits and gravy. Grits were corn ground coarse, a staple that could be made from corn grown in the family garden or bought cheaply at the mill. When topped with gravy, they transformed from simple porridge into a satisfying meal that could sustain a family through long, hard days. The grits would be cooked slowly, stirred constantly to prevent lumps, until they reached a creamy, smooth consistency that provided the perfect base for gravy. The gravy might be made from whatever fat was available: bacon drippings, sausage grease, or ham fat, combined with flour and liquid to create a rich, thick sauce. Sometimes, there would be bits of meat mixed in. Other times, just the flavor that came from the rendered fat. Salt and pepper were essential seasonings, and black pepper was generous when available. This dish represented the Southern principle of making do with what you had: corn that was cheap and available, fat that was saved from other cooking, and flour that was used sparingly but effectively. The result was comfort food that filled bellies and warmed hearts, even in the coldest, hungriest times. Cabbage with bacon or salt pork. Cabbage was a miracle vegetable for Depression-era families. It was cheap, it kept well without refrigeration, and it could be prepared in countless ways. When cooked with bacon or salt pork, it transformed from a simple vegetable into a rich, satisfying dish that could serve as a main course rather than just a side. The key was in the slow cooking, allowing the cabbage to absorb all the smoky, salty flavors from the pork while becoming tender and sweet. A small amount of bacon or salt pork would be chopped and rendered in a heavy pot, creating flavorful fat that would cook the cabbage. The cabbage would be added in large amounts. What seemed like enough for an army would cook down to just the right amount for the family. Onions would be added if available, and the whole mixture would cook slowly until the cabbage was completely tender and infused with pork flavor. This dish proved that vegetables didn't have to be boring or unsatisfying. With the right treatment, they could be the star of the meal. The cooking liquid that remained was often saved and used as a base for soup, ensuring that every bit of nutrition and flavor was preserved. Potato soup. When potatoes were plentiful, but other ingredients were scarce, potato soup became a way to create a filling, comforting meal from minimal resources. Potatoes were often the most affordable vegetable available, especially when bought in large sacks or grown in the family garden. The soup was simple but satisfying. Potatoes cooked until tender, then mashed or left chunky depending on preference, and mixed with whatever liquid was available. The base might be water flavored with bacon drippings, milk when the family could afford it, or stock saved from cooking other meals. Onions would add flavor when available, and salt and pepper were essential seasonings. Sometimes, if the family was fortunate, there might be bits of bacon or ham mixed in, but often the soup was vegetarian by necessity rather than choice. The result was a thick, creamy soup that could fill hungry stomachs and provide the carbohydrates needed for physical labor. This dish taught the lesson that simple ingredients, when treated with care and cooked properly, could create something comforting and satisfying even in the most difficult times. Turnip greens and pot liquor. Turnip greens were often considered weeds by those who didn't understand their value, but Southern cooks knew they were nutritional powerhouses that could sustain families through winter months. These hardy greens could survive frost and poor soil, making them reliable sources of vitamins and minerals when other vegetables failed. The pot liquor, the cooking liquid left after the greens were done, was considered as valuable as the greens themselves, packed with nutrients that leached out during the long cooking process. The greens would be cleaned carefully, removing any tough stems and damaged leaves, then cooked slowly with whatever pork was available. A ham hock, salt pork, or just bacon grease if meat was too expensive. The cooking process took patience, as the greens needed time to become tender and absorb the smoky flavors from the pork. The resulting pot liquor would be dark and rich, perfect for sopping up with cornbread or using as a base for other dishes. Children would be encouraged to drink this liquid, knowing it contained essential vitamins that might be lacking in their limited diet. This dish represented the Southern understanding that nutrition could come from unexpected sources. What others might discard as weeds could sustain life when prepared properly. Fried salt pork. Salt pork was preservation at its most basic. Pork cured in salt to last through months without refrigeration. When money was tight, it provided essential fats and proteins that families needed to survive. Fried salt pork required skill to prepare properly. Too little cooking, and it would be tough and overly salty. Too much, and it would become hard and inedible. The trick was to slice it thin, soak it briefly to remove excess salt, then fry it slowly until it was crispy and the fat was rendered. The resulting cracklings would be crispy and flavorful, while the rendered fat would be saved for cooking other dishes. It was too valuable to waste. This fat would flavor vegetables, make gravy, and provide the cooking medium for cornbread and biscuits. The salt pork itself might be eaten as a side dish with vegetables, or crumbled into other dishes to add protein and flavor. This food represented the Southern principle of using every part of the animal, wasting nothing, and understanding that preservation techniques could turn perishable meat into shelf-stable protein that could sustain a family through lean times. Tomato sandwich. During tomato season, when garden plants were heavy with fruit, the tomato sandwich became a celebration of simplicity and freshness. But even this simple pleasure required creativity during hard times. Good bread wasn't always available, and mayonnaise was a luxury that many families couldn't afford. The sandwich might be made on homemade biscuits, cornbread, or whatever bread could be managed, with the tomato seasoned generously with salt and pepper. Sometimes, when mayonnaise wasn't available, the sandwich would be made with just butter, or even eaten dry with a tomato, providing all the moisture needed. The key was in choosing the perfect tomato, ripe but not overripe, full of juice and flavor that would soak into the bread. This simple meal represented the Southern understanding that the best food often came from the simplest ingredients, prepared with care, and eaten at the peak of their season. During the height of summer, when tomatoes were plentiful, families might eat these sandwiches for lunch day after day, never tiring of the perfect combination of sweet tomato, salt, and bread. Hoe cakes. Hoe cakes got their name from being cooked on the flat blade of a hoe over an open fire, but they represented much more than their humble origins suggested. Made from just cornmeal, water, and salt, they were the ultimate survival food, ingredients that could be stored almost indefinitely and turned into hot, filling bread with minimal equipment. The batter would be mixed just thick enough to hold together, then cooked on a hot griddle or skillet until crispy outside and tender inside. These weren't fancy. They were sustenance food, designed to fill hungry stomachs when flour for biscuits wasn't available or was too precious to use. The cornmeal might be ground from corn grown on the family farm, or bought in large quantities when money allowed. The hoe cakes would be eaten hot from the griddle, maybe with a little molasses or honey if the family was fortunate, or simply with butter made from the family cow. This food represented self-sufficiency and the ability to create something satisfying from the most basic ingredients, proving that poverty didn't have to mean going hungry if you knew how to cook. Molasses bread. When white sugar was too expensive, molasses became the sweetener that made bread palatable and provided essential calories and minerals. Molasses bread was dark, dense, and filling, made with cornmeal or whatever flour was available, mixed with molasses and water to create a heavy, nutritious loaf that could sustain working families through long days. The molasses provided not just sweetness, but also iron and other minerals that might be lacking in a limited diet. The bread would be baked in whatever pan was available, sometimes a cast iron pot, sometimes a makeshift oven created from a Dutch oven and coals. The result was a dark, heavy loaf that sliced thick and filled stomachs effectively. This wasn't light, fluffy bread. It was sustenance food, designed to provide maximum nutrition and calories from affordable ingredients. Children might eat thick slices for breakfast, dinner, or supper, with the molasses providing energy for growing bodies. The bread kept well without refrigeration, making it practical for families who needed food that would last several days without spoiling.